I'm Mike Slott. I'm a lecturer in the Labor Studies Department at Rutgers University. In this brief video, I'd like to discuss the challenges that African American workers have faced to gain full participation and rights within the U.S. labor movement. This is a history that reveals sadly the terrible impact of racism in society and the labor movement, but also the inspiring struggle of African American workers for full rights and equality within labor organizations and the workplace. The struggle has included at times support by white workers and other groups to form alliances with African American workers to create a vibrant, progressive, and powerful movement for multiracial unionism. Now, if we go back to the pre-Civil War period in the early 19th century, most African Americans were not involved in paid employment and were not in unions. Most African Americans were enslaved people. They worked and were exploited on farms and plantations and were barred from most skilled craft jobs. The unions that did exist back then were craft unions, which represented white men who had skilled trades. Unions of that period were mostly local, but in the 1850s and 1860s, national unions and associations began to be formed. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the National Labor Union was formed the following year and declared to admit members regardless of an individual's color or nationality. However, its affiliated unions continued to exclude or segregate workers by race, as white members in the union tried to limit competition from African Americans for jobs. In response, in December 1869, Frederick Douglass and other progressive leaders supported the creation of the Colored National Labor Union, which had its first convention in Washington, D.C. This union was a counterpart to the white National Labor Union and was in existence for a few years. In the late 19th century, the two most important national labor organizations were the Knights of Labor, which began in 1869, and the American Federation of Labor that had its founding convention in 1886. These organizations were quite different in terms of their policies and practices toward African American workers. The Knights were the first national labor organization to open its doors to almost all workers, including African Americans. While the Knights were inclusive, African Americans still did not have full equality within the organization. In the South, for example, African Americans were members of the Knights, but mostly were in segregated local assemblies. After the Knights were decimated by an employer backlash, which began in 1886 and lasted for a few years after, the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, revived the labor movement by organizing skilled workers. The AFL had a more exclusive membership, primarily white male skilled craft workers. While the national leadership did not espouse discriminatory policies, they did not attempt to confront or change the AFL affiliates who did have discriminatory policies. One important exception to this was the United Mine Workers of America, which had African American members and leaders. So, for the most part, African Americans remained shut out from unions during the late 19th century. Unions' exclusion of African Americans was used by employers, the bosses, to strengthen their control and to worsen conflicts between white and African American workers. A key tactic was for employers to use African Americans as strikebreakers. In other words, they were brought in to replace the workers who were on strike and to keep the company in operation. African American strikebreakers were used in almost every major confrontation between employers and labor, including the Pullman Railroad strike of 1894, the steel strike of 1919, and the coal strike of 1924 to 27. World War I had a very important impact on African American workers. As the economy expanded from 1914 to 1918 to meet the wartime production needs, African Americans joined the industrial labor force, as several million men were drafted, trained, and sent overseas to fight. This was a big gain for African Americans and was the stimulus for a massive migration of African Americans from the South to the North, where industrial jobs and other employment opportunities existed in this period. But during the war, African Americans faced labor-related violence as white workers resisted their inclusion in the workforce in some companies. The worst recorded incident of labor-related racial violence occurred in St. Louis in 1917, when the aluminum ore company brought in African American workers to break a strike. 3,000 white union members marched in protest. Roving white mobs rampaged through Black East St. Louis, burning homes and businesses, and assaulting men, women, and children. Between 100 and 200 African American working people died, and 6,000 were left homeless. And after the war, in the summer of 1919, racial tensions between white and African American workers increased as white mobs attacked Black communities in a number of cities, including Chicago and Tulsa, Oklahoma. The following decade, the 1920s, was generally a period of decline for the labor movement. But an important exception was the formation of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925 by A. Philip Randolph and other African American labor activists. The union not only had to fight a battle against the company, but also overcome the skepticism and anger among African American workers about unions, many of whom were still hostile to African American participation. Although the union didn't succeed in getting a contract, which improved wages, benefits, and conditions for porters until 1937, this struggle was a great example of the potential for African Americans to play a leading role in the labor movement. Randolph would continue to be a prominent labor leader until his death in 1979. But it wasn't until the 1930s, during the Great Depression years, and the presidential administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal, that African American workers made important strides within the labor movement. As the labor movement began to revive in 1933 and 1934, African Americans had an important role in this process. For example, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which was founded in 1934, was an interracial union led by African American socialists, which focused on the living conditions of tenant farmers and sharecroppers. The most important development for African Americans, however, was the formation of a new national labor organization, the Committee for Industrial Organization, or CIO. The CIO was a federation of industrial unions and offered African Americans significant opportunities for involvement. While racism continued to be very potent among white workers, CIO leaders recognized the need for interracial unity. And so African Americans became a key component of the interracial industrial unionism of steel, packing house, and other sectors of the economy. Two CIO unions in particular emphasized multiracial unity and the need for African Americans to be represented at all levels of the union: the United Packing House Workers and the United Electrical Workers. Like World War I, World War II was both a period of progress, but also one of challenges and continued discrimination and conflict for African Americans, even after the great advances made through the CIO. During this period, from 1941 to 1945, many African Americans gained access to jobs and higher incomes in the northern and western regions of the U.S., where well-paying industrial unionized jobs were located. As members of the CIO and other unions, they gained a higher standard of living and had rights on the job. The AFL, however, was generally not supportive of including African Americans in their union, so they can continue their exclusionary policies. The economic boom and increased job security was accompanied by a more assertive civil rights movement in this country. A. Philip Randolph challenged President Roosevelt and the federal government to ensure that African American workers were not discriminated against in employment and got access to good jobs in defense industries. When Randolph began organizing a march on Washington, D.C. in 1941 to secure these demands, Roosevelt issued an executive order creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which directed federal agencies to prohibit job discrimination in war industries. The increasing assertiveness of African Americans and their expanded role in industry unfortunately led to a reaction by racist whites. White workers in some factories and companies engaged during the war in so-called hate strikes to block African Americans from getting jobs, including in a few auto factories. However, CIO labor leaders worked hard to suppress these hate strikes and were fairly successful. After the war was over in 1945, unions emerged as a very strong force in our society. But anti-communism and the rise of more conservative politics in this period put the labor and civil rights movement on the defensive. Despite the political backlash, when the AFL and the CIO merged in 1955, the new organization created a civil rights department. Organized labor also backed the civil rights movement's campaigns against discrimination in public facilities, housing, education, and voting by providing financial resources, legal support, publicity, and lobbying efforts in Congress. And in 1963, the labor movement began to play an even larger role in the civil rights movement by mobilizing 40,000 union members for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. The following year, the AFL-CIO provided critical lobbying support and testimony for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These two laws led to the filing of thousands of successful cases against workplace discrimination and eliminated many of the racist voting restrictions in the South. During the 1960s, sections of the labor movement and the civil rights movement worked very closely together. Public employee unions, government employee unions, expanded greatly in the 1960s, in large part from the activism of African American workers. And one of the most important examples of this connection between the labor movement and the civil rights movement is the strike of city sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. When the city government, which was controlled by whites, refused to recognize the workers' union and their demands, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. got involved in the strike and led protests in support of the workers, who were entirely African American. While in Memphis supporting the strike, Dr. King was assassinated. Yet while unions and the civil rights movement worked closely in some areas, there was continuing conflict in others. Many AFL construction trades unions still resisted including African Americans and had to be sued under the Civil Rights Act to change their policies. At the same time, in the auto industry, groups of younger, radical African American activists protested against the union leadership's failure to address their issues. They formed militant rank and file caucuses, which were repressed by the United Auto Workers leadership. Since the 1970s and the great push for civil rights, African Americans have continued to make progress in the labor movement. Among major race and ethnicity groups, African American workers have a higher union membership rate than white, Asian, and Hispanic workers. Union leaderships more accurately reflect the percentage of African American union members. And at the top level of the AFL-CIO, African Americans compose over 20% of the members of the AFL-CIO Executive Council. The labor movement today also has strong alliances with civil rights and human rights groups and has taken generally progressive positions on key issues facing African Americans, such as the Black Lives Matter movement. Yet, much more progress needs to be made. As a result of deindustrialization, outsourcing, and employer attacks on industrial and private sector unions from the late 1970s to recently, African American workers were severely and disproportionately impacted. And African Americans still face racism and discrimination in the job market and economy, while holding a disproportionate share of the lowest paid job. The economy as a whole continues to be dominated by a corporate elite, and all workers face daily challenges to gain a decent living and to be treated well on the job. So the struggle continues on many fronts for African Americans and their white allies who support efforts to create a society which provides all people with the resources and rights to live a decent and full life.